We covered the image frame and also the two basic principles of composition, contrast and balance. Now it's time to start thinking about the actual process of composition in the field and how to decide what will go into the image frame. So the first question that we have to answer when we're out in the field is, what's the photo really about? Who's the main character? Who's the hero of our story? In simple terms, we have to decide about our subject. Then we also have to ask the question, how much do we want the subject to fill the frame? Do we want to get closer, or perhaps we want to pull back to include more of the surroundings? And finally, we want to decide where to position the subject. In today's class and also in the next ones, we're going throughout all this process. So the first step is identifying the subject. In wildlife photography, subject can be in very different types and forms. We can have only part of a wildlife animal. So when we want to focus on very specific details, and these are, for example, the super close-up photos. Then we also have the traditional wildlife portrait when we have a single subject. We can also have more than one subject, so it can be two or more subjects which remain clearly distinguishable. And this is the major difference versus taking photos of a large group of animals when the individual subjects are not clearly visible. And in fact, the group mostly act as one. Now, when it comes to deciding who's your subject, it's really important to highlight how much the dynamics of a wildlife photo really changes. If you have only part of an animal or a single animal, normally those type of photos favor a more direct and intimate connection with the viewer. On the other hand, if you have more than one subject, normally those photos will become more powerful because in a more easy way, they tell a specific story. Obviously, the more the subjects, the higher the complexity and the management of the composition. So all of these elements have to be taken into account when you decide who's the subject you want to focus to. Now, thinking about photos with multiple subjects, I would like here to introduce the first of several rules that we're going to see together, namely the rule of odds. According to this rule, an odd number rather than an even number of subjects will produce a more interesting and visually pleasing composition. So in this example, you have three little grapes. The reason why this rule normally works is that whenever you have an odd number, that's a bit of a way to break the symmetry and break the predictability of the photo. So in this case, for example, you have two subjects looking towards the left and you have one subject looking towards the right. And you can see that this creates a form of tension that normally is quite attractive at the eyes of the viewer. Now, does this mean that whenever you're taking a wildlife photo, you always have to include three subjects or even number of subjects? Obviously not. As you've seen also in the slide before, when we had the pair of puffins, it's completely normal that, for example, if you're taking photos of any behavior related to breeding, you may have a pair, like courtship display. Obviously, you will have only two subjects. However, in those cases, you have more subjects but not directly interacting with each other. I think that this rule can definitely help to enhance your composition. So we have identified our subject, and now it's time to decide how much space do we want the subject to fill in the frame. There are two major types of photos. The small in frame, where the subject, as the name suggests, occupies a very small proportion of the frame. And then we have the older frame, where on the other hand, the subject is really large, so occupies a high percentage of the frame. Obviously, these are just two examples, but in reality, we have a whole spectrum. So we can go from photos that are really extreme, where the subject is really, really tiny in the frame, and then the subject you can see constantly grows until we get to photos where 100% of the frame is actually occupied by the subject. I think you can immediately appreciate how much these photos are different from one another and also how the feelings that they transmit are really different. Now, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the reasons why, however, wildlife photographers look like focus largely on this type of photos. So they really are more based on this side of the spectrum. And I think that this is really rooted in a common misconception about wildlife photography, which is that only wildlife photos with subject occupying a high percentage of the frame are good wildlife photos. A wildlife photo where the subject occupies the vast majority of the frame is just a type of wildlife photo. And as any type, it has its pros and its implications, but it's only an option. And the reason why I want to stress this is that I think that very often wildlife photographers, especially beginners, tend to focus so much on this type of photos simply because it's the most common one, especially on social media. Because we have to be honest, these photos tend to perform well on social media. Now, obviously, there's no issue if you like taking close ups and portraits, that's perfectly fine. But I just want you to encourage to reflect on why you're taking those photos. Is it because you really like those, or is it because maybe you're only taking those because they are the most common type of photos you see other people taking, and so perhaps you're limiting yourself? Just something to think about. Anyway, if we exclude the photos where 100% of the frame is filled by the subject, which are a very specific type of photo, you will always have some space to manage in your composition. And I call this section background and beyond because I think that the conversation when it comes to wildlife photography is too much focused on how to manage the background, but in reality, the background is only a part. And when it comes to composition, we have so many other elements that we can actually use at our own advantage to enhance our composition. So we start with the minimal space that you should always leave around your subject, and we call this breathing space. So literally meaning leaving subject enough room to breathe. This basically in practice means leaving some area around the subject, especially away from the edges, because if you remember, everything which is too close to the edges has an increased visual weight. And also because everything which is too close to the edges really risk to impact the visual experience of the viewer. If you think about a viewer who goes to see your photo, the eyes of the viewer will scan through the photo. And then if you imagine if the photo was cropped here, that viewer experience feels a bit interrupted. It's literally like traveling and then all of a sudden you find a block, in this case, the frame edge. So you always want to leave that space. The second concept here is also to leave more space in the direction your subject is facing. And this is strictly related to other important elements of composition, with our lines, which we will see in the next classes. So that was about the minimal space that we always have to include in our wildlife photos. But then we can also ask ourselves, what else we can include, how we can use some extra space. I think that one of the easiest way to start improving your composition in terms of space management is to think how you can more mindfully include the habitat of your animal. The habitat is actually fundamental. If it wasn't for that specific habitat, actually that animal would not be there at all. So I think that habitat is really worth to be represented in our wildlife photography. So here you can see different examples that go from a really extreme small frame, like this little egret surrounded by this large river and the tropical rainforest, or also these ibex on the top of this mountain. And here is a more halfway type of photo where there are habitat elements like the seaweed and you can see the sea, but the subject is also a bit larger in the frame. The other advantage of including space, more space, is that we also get the chance to tell a better and larger story. So, for example, if you think about it, if you imagine in this case, if I would have zoomed completely on this chamois, I would have not been able to show how big this surface is. This is actually the surface of a large dam. So here you can see the animal put much more into context. So in this case, it's just licking the salt from this dam wall. And you can also get much more the idea of scale. And this is similar to this photo of common wood pigeons. Of course, I could have used my Super Tele to take a portrait of these birds, but in this case, I decided to include more of the space around it because I found it very interesting the fact that these wood pigeons are actually living in one of the most touristic areas in the world, literally under the Tour Eiffel in Paris. So until now, we have to see how to fill the space within the image frame. So first of all, with our subject, but also, for example, with habitat or other elements in the surroundings. And this is now very important to make the distinction between full space and negative or empty space. So using the same photo as an example, here you can see the subject and also the space occupied by the mountaintop is still full space, meaning that this part of the image is a part that has details. So immediately the eyes of the viewer will be drawn to it. And this is the clear difference with the negative space. So the negative space can be defined as any area of the image which lacks clear detail. So in one sense, if the eyes of the viewer wander to that part, the eyes will be left wandering and going around because there's nothing the eyes can hold on to. Negative space is a very powerful composition tool that, however, is quite underrated in wildlife photography. On one side, negative space is associated to a more minimalistic approach to photography. So it's much more about really simplifying as much as possible the scene. And negative space has also very strong positive effects and impacts on your photos. First of all, it can really help to make your subject stand out. Then it can also help to convey very specific messages and moods. It can be loneliness, it can be smallness, it can be lightness. That also depends on the type of photo. And then on a more general level, photos that have lots of negative space tend to make the photo much more unique. And the positive thing is that when we are wildlife photographers, there are lots of elements that can help us to build negative space. If you just think about the sky or the sea, or even if you just have a very wide area of grassland, for example. So I would encourage everyone to try to implement more negative space in your wildlife photos. Now we can move to think more about how to practically manage the space in your wildlife photo. So in many cases, in wildlife photography conversations, the discussion is all surrounding the background. But in reality, when we think about which are really the layers in a wildlife photo, we often forget about the foreground. So everything which is between you and the subject. And in most cases, in wildlife photography, there will be something between you and the subject. I think that it's very rare the case when you're really so close that there's literally nothing between the two. And this is really important because layers are really great elements that can elevate your composition. So another few words on the importance of foreground and why its inclusion in wildlife photography is pretty underrated. Foreground really help to create a sense of depth and enhances the feel of space. And this is really important because we will see in one of the next classes, one of the major effects of super tele lenses, as the ones that we mostly use in wildlife photography, have actually the effect of compressing the image. So by adding the foreground, we are trying to compensate a bit for this lack of depth. Does this mean that you always have to include the foreground in your wildlife photos? Obviously not. Having only the background is perfectly fine. It's all about what you want to transmit with your photo. The photos that only have the background normally lack depth, but this can also be an intentional effect because when there's less sense of space, normally the connection with the viewer feels more direct because it's like you're avoiding to include anything else between you and the subject. These photos on a general level also just feel much more graphic and they can definitely work brilliantly too. So when it comes to layers in wildlife photography, our goal should be to have enough subject isolation. So it's not really about having always the super smooth, clean background. That's nice, but I hope that with this class you understood that sometimes the scene is just more complex and that can also still work in a good composition. But how we can try to get more subject isolation? The first thing that we can act on is the distance. So trying to get closer to the subject. I know that this is not always easy, so we can also just try to get the subject further away from the background. This can also just mean moving by a few steps on the right and or on the left, and you will see that maybe that branch that was right behind the subject is not there anymore. Of course, we can also add on parameters like the aperture. And also remember to use the concept of contrast at your advantage. So use light and colors, as we will see later on. And also, obviously, as a last resort, you always have editing, so you can act on sharpness, contrast, texture, so the subject can stand out more. In this class, we covered the first steps of the composition process in the field. We started understanding how to identify the subject and then also reflecting on how much frame do we want our subject to fill. And I hope that after this, you feel more inspired also to try other type of wildlife photos that maybe you haven't experimented with yet. And I also hope that you will start to include more habitat and maybe more negative space in your wildlife photos.